Hello everyone. So, a while back, I made a video talking about a LEGO Castle faction that I thought was perhaps most maligned by our community. Of course, I'm talking about the Rogue Knights from Knights Kingdom 2. While working on that video, which I still think ranks as one of my best, I found myself increasingly interested in the idea of building a Rogue Knight army for myself. While I wouldn't claim that this is the only Rogue Knight army in the world, I cannot imagine that there are too many Rogue Knight fans out there with large armies. So, until I'm proven otherwise, I think this is the largest. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through this army. I'm going to discuss exactly what I built it around, I'll give you some lore details, and maybe even I'll tell you about what I plan on doing with this army going forward. So, starting with the composition. I think the video that most inspired me with regards to army building was Goldfire's video about how he built his Raven Knights army. If you don't know Goldfire, I think he's one of the best LEGO Castle creators on YouTube, and I think he's got one of the most impressive Raven Knight armies that's even on YouTube. I certainly think that it's a huge challenge to try an army build with an army whose singular figure is just one very expensive LEGO Knight. I think it's even more impressive to see that Goldfire has managed to actually rise to that occasion and build a whole army out of them. His crossbowmen in particular, with the Mando capes, I think they've become something of a standard for me when I think of what an elite crossbowman unit ought to look like. But, importantly for this video, Goldfire's basic composition is some infantry, melee and ranged, some cavalry, commanders, and artillery. So I think that's the model that I'm going to use. So to start with my army, I followed that composition. The main force of my army is made up of an infantry unit that's armed with halberds and that has light to medium armor. This unit is about 14 soldiers strong, and they're also wearing the Rogue Knight livery, which is black and bright yellow. Supporting them is a crossbowman unit armed with crossbows and also wearing light to medium armor, and they're also wearing the Rogue Knight livery. These are my basic forces. These are the kinds of soldiers that you'd expect to see in large numbers in any Rogue Knight army, at least according to me. Rounding out this composition are my more elite but less numerous elements. Firstly, we have our 5 heavy cavalry soldiers who are armed with lances and shields. In Goldfire's video on his army building process, I think Goldfire said it best that in order for heavy cavalry to feel like heavy cavalry, they need to have barding. As you can see, my horses are wearing barding with the Rogue Knight livery that's emblazoned on the barding itself. To contrast against them, I've got 9 foot knights, although the term men-at-arms is probably more descriptive and correct. These soldiers are wearing heavy armor, or at least heavier armor than the common foot soldiers, and they're armed with two-handed maces. The army also has 2 LEGO cannons that I took off a pirate ship, but they're not exactly pictured because they're still in storage. Finally, the army is led by a knight commander. Here he is, pictured with his custom LEGO greatsword, and of course, he's gotta have a knightly bassinet helmet. I think that with his black armor, he totally stands out as somebody who would be leading an army like this, although I haven't exactly decided on a cape yet. I think your heroes have to have capes. All in all, I think that this is quite a formidable LEGO army. It's not the largest, per se, sure, but I think it is definitely large enough to give you an impression of how I think a Rogue Knight army would actually operate. So, for the army lore, which is of course an important part of the army building process, I don't necessarily want to recap everything that I've talked about in my other video. Rather, I think it's enough to say that the Rogue Knights are somewhere between a bandit faction, like the Wolf Pack, and a true kingdom faction, like the Black Falcons. For me, what defines the Rogue Knights is that they are a mercenary faction, with perhaps not as many resources as a true kingdom faction, but they're way better organized than any bandit faction. They have the means to put an army into the field to actually fight somebody, because field battles were relatively rare in medieval times, but at the same time, they're going to rely more on infantry and non-standard tactics because they don't have the numbers of a full kingdom faction. I also don't think that they would be able to field huge numbers of cavalry. Cavalry traditionally are things that are associated with medieval feudalism, and I think that as a non-kingdom faction, I don't necessarily think they'd have as many knights or heavy cavalry as maybe a true kingdom. I also think that them being a mercenary faction will play a role in their development. The Rogue Knights, in my opinion, are what their name implies. They're renegades and exiles from other knight factions who have banded together for their own security and prosperity. They're willing to take mercenary work, because that's how they support themselves, but they're not inherently evil. And we see that is reflected in how the army is built. Their foot soldiers use halberds instead of spears because the halberd is just more versatile than a spear. A lot of the baseline Castle factions, I think, arm their soldiers in mail armor with heraldic surcoats, but these guys are wearing coats of scale, chain, and even brigandine. A man wears what he can afford. There's less uniformity. The halberd is a weapon that I think works well against a wide variety of enemies. You can resist a cavalry charge with that weapon, but you can also deal with armored opponents. You're less encumbered than a spear and a shield, although, of course, I think that there might be shields available for when they might need them, like for example during a siege. Similarly, I think that a crossbow is a great weapon for a mercenary army. It packs a lot of punch, is easier to train soldiers with than a bow, can be fired from a stationary position like a castle wall or from a pavis, and while it's not depicted here, I'm imagining that these crossbowmen would have pavises. Maybe they'd be carried by an oxen and a cart, and it would be for sieges or very difficult battles. Their armor is also a mix because, again, each man will wear what he can afford to wear. With the more elite elements of the army, the mounted knights for example, they would represent the very top echelon of the Rogue Knights army. They are, for sure, exiled knights or otherwise freelance mounted warriors. They might show up with a horse and armor to a stronghold of the Rogue Knights, and then, of course, barter for a better position in the army by virtue of the fact that they can ride. They wear plate armor and they fight with lances, and I think the one concession that I have for these horses is that they do need to have some kind of themed barding, right? That's just a way of making sure that you can indicate that these knights are actually much higher status than the regular foot soldiers who, although they're wearing the colors of the Rogue Knights, don't exactly have a uniform. The men-at-arms and foot are also built around a similar method. In my lore, a lower status or poorer noble, one without a horse, can serve as a heavy infantry fighter. Alternatively, a common footman, should he save enough money to afford the equipment, can always level up into a heavy infantry fighter if he chooses. These soldiers wear open-faced helms and a mix of plate and brigandine armor to signify their status as elite warriors. There's also more gray on their bodies to show that they are actually wearing more armor, and not necessarily cloth. Finally, I thought that they should be armed with two-handed weapons, but the weapon that makes the most sense for dealing with armor is the mace or the hammer, hence why they're armed with large maces or hammers. It's a cheap but destructive weapon that will allow them to crack skulls and bash people even through their armor, while hopefully being protected by their own. Finally, I think that as mercenaries, they would probably want to bring the most efficient siege weapons that they could afford, hence why they have access to cannons. Maybe they got them from dwarves. Time is money after all, and I don't think they'd want to waste time on lengthy sieges when they can punch a hole right into a castle's wall and head in there for an assault. Although these are far from medieval cannons, I think they do the job. I'm very much interested in expanding the artillery train, but that will have to wait for future. In the final section, I'm going to talk about how I actually built this army. The vast majority of the parts are from Pick-a-Brick. If you don't know, LEGO has a service called Pick-a-Brick, or PAB. Using this service, if you're in the US or Europe for the most part, this allows you to buy individual LEGO bricks. So for the most part, I went for a mix of the cheapest bright and black yellow parts that I could find. Then I set about kit bashing them together, basically taking off arms and legs and swapping them about until I felt like I had a good mix of types. The torsos, as you will notice, are not regular LEGO torsos. Instead, I had made these by sticking on custom stickers to give these soldiers an appearance of a much more armored torso than what LEGO normally provides. The reason I did this, although some LEGO purists might hate it, is I felt that the cost of making or getting more realistic LEGO torsos would be way too high in terms of what I could actually afford, and by applying stickers to these new parts, I wouldn't be damaging any valuable existing parts that you might be able to buy on the market. The horse barding is also custom. I think it's a must if you have to sell the idea that your knights are heavy cavalry. I've never liked plastic barding very much. In fact, I think it's very costly and very bulky. Cloth barding, by contrast, is much better. Finally, the knight who leads the army has a custom helmet and greatsword, which I found from a historical brick-armed dealer. I felt like the leader needed to look especially different, and that's the look that I went with. Astute viewers might notice that I've used photos showing both flesh-colored and traditional LEGO heads for this video. In my last video about the Rogue Knights, I stand by my statement that the traditional yellow LEGO head is fine for the Rogue Knights. However, since I needed to get more heads anyway, I thought it would be good to see how the flesh-colored tone heads would look in this kind of army. So I got both, and I plan on using both types of heads as and when I need to. So, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that you've enjoyed this showcase for my new LEGO army. I'm hoping to do more videos featuring them or about them in the future, especially of course in the context of tabletop wargames. You'll notice of course that this army composition is very specific. In fact, I plan on using this army in Warhammer the Old World, but that's for another video. The channel has really grown quite a bit in recent times, and I appreciate all the engagement. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me in making this kind of thing in the future. Until next time, everybody, have a nice day and take care. Goodbye.